and welcome to Nick Loading In, my commentary channel. Today we're going to jump into Kevin Spills It All Part 2. Part 1 was released a few days back, kind of covering the first portion and more of the timeline relative to the relationships between the Hannahs and the Frankes and the connections and all of that. But today, Part 2 is going to be focusing on the money, the move, how Jodi talked about it on her phone calls from jail, how Ruby talked about it on her phone calls from jail as well, how it's listed all over the journals, their plan to move to Arizona, and how I think that though there's not much information exactly directly on the pen papers besides their mentioning and Kevin's statement, and obviously there's no proof of existence where they left off with that interview. Police didn't know if they even had them. But nonetheless, I think they do have some direct tie to Ruby and Jodi's whole masterful plan for Arizona. So that's what's going to be included in today's video. Before we get into it, as always, everything in this video is my opinion and speculation. I do encourage that everybody go and do their own research, formulate their own opinions, and as always, please do so respectfully. All right, let's jump into this. Okay. So, per Kevin's second interview with police, it appears that Ruby was up to some pretty shiesty shit that last couple months from July to August to the date of their arrest, right? And based off of the journals and based off of Kevin's interview, everything really does line up. Let's take a listen.
But it was strange because at that time, around that time, things with Ruby started, like, picking up. And I didn't understand why, but, like, Ruby wanted to meet in a parking lot and wanted me to sign over titles of documents. Like, the two of our cars wanted me to sign them over to her name. And
to Ruby?
Mm-hmm. But I was like, okay, you know, I'm just not, I'm in total compliance mode at this point. Just like, I'm a good husband, you see, you can trust me, and so whatever she asked, like, sign over the cars to me, no questions, just okay. And then another thing, she was like, I might want to do an investment, but I will need your signature. Do you trust me enough that I could get your signature if I wanted to pursue my own investment? Yeah, sure. Whatever you say.
How big of an investment was she talking about? What did she tell you?
She never did, and I never signed anything. She never brought anything to me. But when I returned to the house, everything was packed up. And a neighbor came over and said she asked for the HOA rules and mentioned to him that she wanted to rent the house out. Which I was like, yeah, are you kidding me? And apparently she wanted to sell the house, but couldn't because my name was on the mortgage. And I think that's what she was talking about, of, will you sign something if I just put it in front of you? And you know what? I probably would have. Like, that's how messed up I was.
I'm glad you didn't.
Me too. That would have been disastrous.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
One last discussion. So, in the home, when the warrant was issued, there was a bag with $85,000 cash in
Yes.
it. And I understand her lawyer, Ruby's lawyer, has all that.
I'm not.
Which home are we talking about?
Ivan.
In Ivan's?
In the Ivan's home.
We don't know. The money was left where it was left. We didn't take
Yeah.
it when he was with us. The house was secured when we left. We're assuming that Lamar Windward
Yeah,
was
he
able
has
to
it.
retrieve it. But we don't. I can't tell you
Yeah.
one or the other. If we did.
So, here's kind of the issue. That money, she cleaned out their bank accounts.
The kids' savings account.
Yeah, and yours too, your joint account.
Yeah.
And that's where that money came from.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you can have, or if I need to have a discussion with the county attorney. Kevin would kind of like his kids' money back.
Okay, so as Kevin states, he feels like things started kind of ramping up right around July, because that was like one of the last interactions he had with her in person. And if we switch over to Ruby's perspective during the same time, she has a journal entry on July 13th that kind of gives us an idea that things had actually kind of started to ramp up, right? So on July 13th, Ruby writes, "These selfish children who desire only to take, lie, and attack have zero understanding of God's love for them. They don't know that G. Joe is selling her home, this priceless Snow Canyon gem, so she can purchase land where these two can work." So just by the way that is worded, It sounds to me like this has been in the works for a while, and it makes me wonder how far back this plan started to come to fruition for these two. Furthermore, there's been a lot of, they started ramping this up because R had tried to run away. It doesn't allude that there was any attempt to run away prior to this, but the date that R actually ends up attempting and failing is 2 days after this entry. He makes that attempt in the wee hours of July 15th. So it's just kind of a weird time frame for them to like all of a sudden be like, so at first when I looked at this, I thought maybe this was all, coming to fruition right then. But then that first little section, the way it's worded, it's like they don't know. Okay, you guys have been talking about this for how long? Where did this begin? Why did this come up? How far back? Right? It will go on to say that Chijo has been looking for property with Soros cactuses. And I'm going to pause here and do a little sidebar really quick. I went and looked up Soros cactuses, and every time I searched Soros, it would come up with saguaro. I think I'm saying that right. Saguaro cactuses. Well, saguaro cactuses are like those huge monstrous cactuses that Arizona is kind of known for, staying 12 feet tall. They are also the ones that bloom, I think, the state flower on them as well. And like I said, every time I searched Soros, I got saguaro. So I don't know if those cactuses are like one and the same, and they get like a short name of Soro because they're in the Soran desert or some shit like that. I don't know. Either way, though, I still couldn't find the significance of why it was so important for these two to have these types of cactuses on the property. I mean, so much so that it goes on to say she is willing to consider less than ideal property for them. This is a spiritual matter. I can't in good faith leave you with these two gremlins. I won't do that. These are God's children. Soros don't matter when souls are on the line. So again, it's a weird sidebar because why are these cactuses so important to them, to Jodi? Is it because they look pretty? Is it, outside of the first thought that I have of like, just another way to make sure that you had like elements and resources on hand to prescribe some type of torturous punishment, like they already use the cactus pokers and all that, right? Sure, that's probably part of it, but there seems to be that obsession with it being on the property to the point where you're looking for properties specifically that has those, like, and maybe more of an abundance of those on it. It's just weird. It's a weird specific thing to point out. Let me know what you think. If you know more about these types of cactuses or what they could be used for or anything like that, go ahead and comment down below. I'd love to hear it and maybe open my mind to more possibilities for this because it's just freaking weird to me. Anyways, she'll go on to say that 1 hour later, we move quickly. Jodi and Jay are going on a road trip to look at property in Arizona. Ruby has some cash in the bank. Sorry, another sidebar really quick, but I did mention this in my previous video with Pam. I said there was 2 journal entries in which Ruby is referred to in third person. The one that I highlighted in the Pam video, it was very clear that this person that was writing that entry had different handwriting. To me, I'm convinced it's somebody else, and I assume and speculate that it was Jodi writing that. I go over a few other reasons why I think that, other than the handwriting is different. Obviously, that's a big one. With this particular entry, though, it's not different handwriting. It seems very much so in alignment with the way that Ruby has written and will write throughout the rest of these entries. So it's very bizarre to me that if she was in fact the one writing, why third person? Why refer to yourself as third person? It's very bizarre to me. But anyways, close that sidebar as well. Ruby has some cash in the bank. If the property is right, we can move on financing immediately. We decided the escalation of the kids is not manageable here. So like I said, I think I don't know if there's something else that happened around this time. Maybe I missed another attempt that R had. But like I said, his attempt to actually leave that's documented in these journals isn't until 2 days later. So it's interesting to me that something like hyped up right here. If I missed something, let me know, correct me, but it's just that part's weird. Now I'm going to circle back to kind of discussing Kevin's interactions with Ruby around this time, right? He talks about how Ruby was wanting him to sign over the 2 vehicles they had into her name. And Kevin apparently complies with that and does end up signing them over, from my understanding. But now, knowing what we know is written in the journals, I speculate there are actually like a couple reasons, if not a few reasons, why these were the next actions that these 2 started taking, Ruby with Kevin and everything like that. The first is the obvious, right? She could be just trying to get as much liquidation of assets or anything like that as possible so that she can free up some stuff for this new investment, which is, i.e., the property that they're looking for in Arizona. If in fact, I mean, I know she states that Jody is looking for land, so I don't know if Jody was on this endeavor to do it on her own and put everything just in her name, or if the plan was to have like Ruby on there as like a co-signer or something as well. But it would make sense that you're trying to clean up your finances around this time. So if she has the cars in her name, she has the full power to make the decision on what to do with those vehicles. If they didn't owe much, maybe she was looking to try to sell and get the money for it, whatever, to put into this, because, right, she drained the bank account. So this would make sense. But there's a part of me that wants to consider the fact that these 2 have to be thinking about a contingency plan with Kevin. I understand that Kevin has been complacent and very compliant to everything going on up until this point. But in my opinion, I think that part of that has to do with the fact that Kevin is supposedly living in a townhome around Mapleton area, is what it was suggested when everything first broke. And if you look at Mapleton to Springville, it's basically the same area. It's the same place. It's 7 minutes away. Obviously, it depends on the exact addresses and whatever else, but it's very, very, very close. So I can speculate that Kevin is being so complacent and compliant because in his mind, because the way he acts in the interview, it's like he did not have any idea that these kids were down there and Ruby was spending 90% of her time in Ivans and not even in Springville. I think he was comforted by the fact that he was only a short distance away from his family while trying to work to get back into it. So even though he's been complacent and compliant, everybody has their breaking point. Everybody has their breaking point. And if you're progressing through this whole program and you're not making any progress, at some point, even I feel like even those with the craziest blinders on, if there was separation like this, Jody and Ruby are off in another state, like Kevin would, I mean, and this is my assumption, and that we will never know exactly how this would have played out, thank God, but I feel like at a certain point he would have been like, what the hell is going on? He would have woken up at least a little bit, right? There, and for Ruby to just take the kids without Kevin's knowledge across state lines to a whole other place, move them there, sell everything, leave nothing in Springville, all behind his back, there could be legal repercussions for that if Kevin decided to do that. Had it got to this point, Kevin would have had some rights. And so I think there was a consideration to the contingency plan on how to control and keep Kevin in his place. And I think this has part to do with that. The cars are a little bit more minuscule. I think maybe it was, if we're not talking about the financial aspect of it, maybe it was so that he wouldn't have any legal recourse necessarily to like report the car stolen or do anything like that to get her into any legal trouble. Because you got to think that these two are also going to be avoiding anything to do with law enforcement or anything entirely. They openly discuss that they know that the rest of the world would see this as wrong and call it, you know, something that it's not. They're fearful when R takes off that night on the 15th. They are aware that their behavior, tactics, and strategies and methodologies are greatly frowned upon and would, you know, result in legal repercussions for them. They know that. So I can't imagine that they're not thinking about Kevin. So let's move into the house, because I think that makes a little bit more of an impact than the cars. He also talks about how he finds out that Ruby, like I think a neighbor approaches him, is what he said. Ruby was talking to HOA about the rules for like renting. There was discussion of trying to sell the home, but she couldn't because Kevin was on it. as well. And so Kevin does talk about this interaction alongside of the cars and signing everything over. Ruby makes a mention that she is thinking about making an investment, and would Kevin essentially sign whatever she put in front of him without really questioning anything and just trust in her and her decision making. It's like a weird backwards gaslighting him into being compliant. At the time, he says he was so messed up in the head, he probably definitely would have signed whatever she put in front of him. But thankfully, she never came back with anything. Nothing ever resulted from this. But I think most people, including Kevin, assumed that it was some idea to try to like slip a piece of paper in front of him to get him removed from the mortgage in the house so that she could sell it. And I do absolutely believe, because we're going to get into like some costs and stuff here in a moment, but I absolutely do believe that that was definitely in the agenda. But a part of me does speculate, wonder, and theorize, was there this potential for them to try to like slip something in front of Kevin in some way to curtail his parental rights over these children that they're taking across state lines without his knowledge necessarily? I don't know the legal proceedings or anything around that. Obviously, like I mentioned, they're not going to want to be doing court hearings and all this other shit for custody. So I just went and did a quick little glance at some options that they might have to work around this in a way. And what I did find was there is a child travel consent form. And from what it looks like is you could literally like go online, fill it all out, and then print it off, take it, get some signatures, and then I don't think it needs like a court approval. I couldn't really find anything that specifically says that you need to have this approved by a judge or anything like that. You can go and look it up. I'll include the website that I found this on in the links down below in the description. But I did find that interesting because basically if they, maybe Ruby came to him and was like, yeah, I'm thinking about this investment because that's the forefront. That is an actual agenda, something that they're trying to do. But what if, and again, speculation, what if it was also to try to maybe sneak something like this in there? If someone can fill out all the information prior to bringing the document, if Kevin doesn't look through the document and just like, oh yeah, sign my name. Now she's got this documentation that says legal consent. Now, how would it hold up depending on how Kevin retaliated, if he did at all? I don't know, but this is just something I wanted to touch on. It's a thought that I had and I wanted to share it, and I would love to find out what anybody else thinks on this potentially. It's very interesting and intriguing, and I ultimately am so glad that we're never going to have to like even have the opportunity to try to find this out. There's not going to be any way to figure out what was really happening here because it never freaking happened. Thank goodness, because I strongly believe that if these children had been taken to Arizona, we would be looking at another Chad and Lori Vallow, Daybell situation. 1000%. They would not have lasted very long out there in their current condition. With that, especially, oh my gosh. So, anyways, let me know what you think on all of that. Now, I did mention just a moment ago that I wanted to go over like the financial part of it and everything. And I'm going to bring up some information surrounding the Ivins home for Jodi. There'll be a couple reasons why we're going to go through this, but let's take a look really quick at what I found. Okay, so I pulled some public records on Jodi's property in Ivins, and what I found was back in 2013 in March, she started proceedings on the purchase of the lot, it looks like. But this purchase doesn't really seem to solidify until 3 years later, where we see the first loan for the first dollar amount taken out at $1.1 million. Real quick little side note. There's two reasons why I'm showing you this. The first, since it comes up first, is if you look here, the address for Jodi is still in American Fork. She was living there before she moved to Ivins, right? So we know that. I believe that she was probably selling this home or something around this time. But then look at the address listed here by the time she's kind of solidifying this whole purchase of the lot, right? Well, I went ahead and looked at Pam Botcher's public records because this address shows up. I remembered it from my previous research as being Pam's and everything when I was originally looking at public records. So I went over and looked at hers. And underneath Pam's, address, it clearly shows that Jody was a resident there, but the timeline, when I looked at it this time, I was like, holy shit, that's a long time. It's from October of 2015 through March of 2020. I just found that interesting. I mean, I know we don't know whether or not she was really actually living there that entire time, but that's a 5-year span. And based off of this, by the time this loan comes out, I feel like this was like the purchase of the lot, and then she doesn't get the full loan again. And this was like directly from a mortgage company, so it's like a loan for $1.3 million. But it's like year's time almost has passed, even more than that. It's almost 2 years, right? We're almost to the end of 2017 by the time this gets solidified, and then you've actually got like the address listed now. Very interesting. If Jody ended up living with Pam for that entire time, that's insane to me. I feel like she probably left a little bit earlier, but I know that in a podcast, Jody was talking about how she purchased the land around 2013, but she didn't start building, I don't believe, is what she said. And I think this was in the Eternal Core podcast with Tom Harrison in 2019. I think she started building in 2017. So she doesn't have this house ready. So, I mean, it would make sense that she was living with Pam. I, at very minimum, speculate that she was definitely living with Pam for like a year at least, because you got the 2015 to like 2016 and solidifying everything, and your address is still listed here, right? So, but also I wanted to show just the cost of what Jody's property and house looked like. 1.1, I mean, this is $2.5 million just this, and then she takes out another $300,000 later in the same year in 2017, and then she's got another $100,000 that she takes out weirdly against the home, it looks like, in 2022, and it's a standalone. From what I understand about a standalone, it's like that's like almost like a second mortgage. So I'm not really sure what she was doing with that, but the point of showing this really is to outline just the substantial amount of cost. If these two are looking for property in Arizona, I went and looked up the property costs for kind of the parameters that they might have been looking for. And for the most part, you're looking between $3 million plus for the amount of acreage that they were looking at, it seems, or would appear, and whether or not the property was functional already or raw land. If you had something that was already built on the property, a home, an establishment of some sorts, it tended to raise the cost quite a bit. Now, if we look at the Ivins home in and of itself, almost cost $3 million, plus a couple other loans she took out against the house. You got to think you're looking at between 400 to 500 acres, it seems. This was like their goal. They wanted a lot of land. They wanted open land. It's talked about a couple times. And so if just that alone, typically those price points are at least $1 million, if not more, for raw land. Then you got to think about the construction cost, and depending on what they were ultimately trying to build and do there, which we're going to get into in a moment, as far as what I speculate the ultimate goal may have been, who knows how much that construction loan would have cost. I mean, we're also talking about a pretty inflated market right now, so it doesn't really help the financial burden of all of this, okay? And that circles us back to like $85,000 drained from the bank accounts, from the kids' savings and Ruby and Kevin's joint account. You got the cars you're trying to sell. Okay, fine, we can't sell the home. Get some passive income by renting it out or what have you. The Ivins home has not yet sold. So comes back to, okay, could be clearing up debts owed, so to clear up the financial aspect of things. But then it comes to the fact that they're already packaged shit up. Jody's home, she mentions it in her jail calls.
Everything got taken out of the house, and it's in a storage unit so that I could come to jail. It sounds crazy, but it really feels that way.
And obviously it's mentioned in the journals, so there's plenty of evidence that this was already happening. But on August 27th, she's talking about how she had a visit her in the Ivins home from the 20th to the 25th, takes her back on the 25th, meets up with Pam apparently in Springville. They were cleaning up some boxes and putting them in a storage in Springville. Pam, A, I believe they said J, and and Ruby. A puts in her 2 weeks at work. You're packing your entire life, and yet the day after the arrest, in a jail call with Kevin, Ruby tries to explain why she took the money.
When I saw how long this separation was lasting, I wanted to think of some ways that I could bring in money or make some money if you didn't ever come back. So that's when I asked if you would co-sign on a loan if I found a house, and maybe I could Airbnb it or rent it out, or I've been playing with numbers in my head and I think I could make something, but I don't want to be dumb, and I want to be very conservative. So I pulled the money and I have it in a bag. And
with you? Do the police have it?
well, I don't know what the police took. I don't know what the police have.
But the bag is at Jody's house?
They can't just take people's money. I mean, that's not right.
Well, they're not going to take the money, but when they have a search warrant, they have access to everything in the house.
Sure. Yeah.
I have a feeling we're going to need that money.
We might do. So, I haven't been making big purchases. I've been very conservative. I think the biggest expense has been the kids' schooling, and that's, they have enough curriculum to get them for a couple years. So.
Okay.
In my opinion, this sounds like a rather concocted story. Oh, I was thinking about taking a loan out for a house so that we could do an Airbnb or something like that, trying to make some side income. When she realized how long the separation was lasting, she didn't know if Kevin would ever come back, so she wanted to make income for herself. I just don't buy it at all. Plus, she never once mentions anything about the fact that she was trying to move to Arizona in any of the phone calls that she has with Kevin, or let alone really anybody else for that matter. Yet she's packing up the entire house in Springville, and as we already heard, Jody's packed up her house in Ivins. And furthermore, Ruby was completely willing to just hand over the 8 passengers brand to Jody. And at that time, while there was some tension between Kevin and her over that decision, because Kevin ultimately agreed with the manager and was like, this woman's trying to screw you over, Ruby tells Kevin that it's not about the money, it's about doing God's work. At this time, this is on August 31st that this jail call happened, she's still very much so tied to Jody, and even in these calls, she's kind of defending her, saying like she does all this stuff for other people, and then they turn around and spite her, basically. So if it was all about God's work and not about the money, then why would you be worried about some side income or some other shit like that? I just don't buy it. It doesn't add up for me. But let me know what you think. Now, I truly believe that this whole Arizona plot and everything, this whole move, was tied directly to the pen papers. Even if it's just one part of that whole vision that was apparently documented, I still feel like this was definitely a part of it somehow. Or at least the pen papers were what put them on this trajectory with the kids a little bit more. Let me get into this.
Yeah, I can do that. I'll ask first, have you found the pen papers?
The pen papers. So we found quite a bit of different journals.
We believe they're on the computer, and the rest of them are unsealed, like they're trying to mail them off. But we do not have a direct copy of it, no.
He won't even answer any other questions until he gets through to these police that he's very intrigued and interested in whether or not they have the pen papers. Now, he mentions it again in closing of the interview. He brings this back up.
Do you have any questions for us?
No, I'm just really interested in the pen papers. Like, for my own curiosity, I want to know what was going on in all of those little interventions. And
for Kevin to bring this up 2 different times, beginning and end of the interview, and his interest and intrigue on whether or not this was located, it got my attention straight away. And I've been just like I can't stop thinking about what was in those pen papers. And like I said, there's not a lot of evidence pointing to their actual existence. Nobody at this point, as far as the public knows, we don't know if they've ever been found or if the police actually ended up having them, because in the conversation they're talking about how they don't think they have them, right? And that's where it's all left off. Nothing has been followed up on those pen papers. Obviously, everybody seems to be pretty intrigued by them, as well as the general public, but nothing has come back from the police or anything on whether or not they found those. And who knows what that would lead to. Again, I've mentioned I don't know if there can be any other legal proceedings on anything that's revolving this whole situation outside of the children's case that's already basically been completed, right? But nonetheless, they are of great importance to Kevin, and his implications that Pam would be directly tied to everything is also probably a big reason why, like, I've sunk my teeth into this topic, and I'm like, I just want to know. But in order to really kind of paint this picture clearly, I feel like I needed to kind of start from the beginning. So Kevin mentions in 2021, March of 2021 to April of 2021, there's this interesting little altercation, fiasco event that happens between Jodi and the Hannahs.
And I don't know exactly what happened, but the Hannahs do. All I know is at some point within a couple days of that, in that month of March, the Hannahs drove down from Mapleton and picked Jodi up and brought her back to their home in Mapleton, and she lived for 6 weeks in that home in Mapleton. And this is where, like, I don't know what happened, but I do know that there's two different sides of stories. According to Jodi, she was held against her will for 6 weeks and was kidnapped, and she escaped and got out. According to the Hannahs, after 6 weeks of Jodi stabbing herself with forks and knives, cutting herself, and wanting to commit and trying to seduce the husband of the family, they kicked her out. I don't know what's the truth. Maybe a little bit of both. I don't know. But the point is, somewhere around mid-April, Jodi was back in her home in Ivans, and she was a hot mess. And she reached out to Ruby for help.
So after this happens, in April, Jodi reaches out to Ruby and asks for Ruby's help, essentially. Kevin also mentions a little bit about how Ruby felt towards the relationship between the Hannahs and Jodi.
And Ruby was always jealous of the Hannahs, that they had a better relationship with Jodi than she did. Ruby, and this is like, goes back to her childhood. She wanted to be the best friend. She wanted to be the most liked. She wanted to be the one that everybody knew. And so it hurt her that she felt like she was being excluded from what was going on at the Hannah's house. And then she'd say, why are so many secrets? And the Hannahs would say, it's not secret, it's sacred. And when the time's right, you can know too, you know.
So it kind of puts Ruby in a kind of vulnerable position in a way, I think, already, just for like this acceptance. But this is where Ruby seems to get sucked in. The sides are chosen, and Ruby decides to be there for Jodi. So they go down in May together, him, Kevin, and Ruby, and visit Jodi in their home, because Kevin's first time being down there, he's totally blown away by the home and everything. He's like, how the hell does a therapist have this type of luxury? Good question, Kevin. But he also goes on to say that, like, weird ass shit started happening, poltergeisty type of stuff, plates flying out of cabinets, crashing out on the floor and stuff all by themselves, crashes happening down in the basement when everybody's upstairs, weird poltergeisty type of stuff. Well, Jodi's basically going through like possessions or something as well at this point. The bishop is down there, is apparently coming over, spending hours at night with Jodi, and then finally in August something breaks. The bishop himself is like, can't keep going on like this. There has to be a resolution. Somewhere along the lines, it gets suggested that Jodi come back and live with them in Springville. So the Frankes take Jodi back to their home, and this is the beginning of where the pen papers seem to be created.
Like every 4 hours at night, and then it moved every 2 hours at night, then it moved every hour at night, and then at some point Ruby said, you know what, I'm just going to start sleeping in there. And if I need you, I'll come down and get you. That's kind of weird, but okay. And that was that. They started sleeping in the same bed, then she started having like trances and stuff. I would say probably September, where she believed that she was going to heaven and seeing God and Jesus and talking with him. And she would get together with Pam Botcher. Ruby, Pam, and Jody would get together and do these interventions. That's what they called them. And so they'd just go up and lock themselves in a room for 4 or 5 hours, and then they'd come out and they'd all just be on cloud nine, and Ruby would share with me like she had this amazing vision, and I wrote it and recorded it all down, and we have a work to do from God, and you're part of it, and the bishop's part of it, and we're all part of bringing all this stuff to the world. And so it was, and it continued like that until I wanted to move on with life. And I would call it dragging my heels, so that was around October. And Jody's understanding was we had purchased as a Christmas present for Jody in 2021 a leather folder that 3 inches thick or whatever, and it had engraved on the leather on the outside the pen papers, and Ruby wrote detailed notes of everything, all interactions with Jody and Pam Botcher from August 2021 until I don't know when.
And you're saying something like, is it like a satchel looking leather bit, or is it more?
The stuff she wrote in the pen papers was not intended to be read by anybody until God would decree them to be written as scripture for the whole world to read.
Okay.
Just in a thing called the pen papers. So it was, and that's how Ruby referred to those papers. Yeah. So it described all of the visions and trances and everything that Jody and Ruby went into.
How thick would you say it was?
It was like 3 inches thick or so. And there were hundreds of pages of written documents that Ruby had. And that was given to Jody in 2022 when she left and returned to her home in January. So
this is similar.
Yeah.
So he says that January 2022, Jody returns to her home. He also says that around this time is when they gifted a leather folder type thing to Jody that had the engraving of the pen papers on the front, and she took those hundreds and hundreds of papers that Ruby and Pam apparently wrote down of Jody's visions and blah 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 with her back to her home in that little briefcase type thing. When I was listening to the interview where they were trying to figure out whether or not they had these pen papers, I know that the detective kind of brings up like, oh, does it kind of look like this? And I don't know if he's just showing an image that he like Googled, tried to find what type of thing this might be, or if he's pulling up evidence photo. But when I went back through and I scoured the evidence photos, there was a couple pictures of some folders with like blurred documents inside. And at first when I was perusing through, because there's 300 flipping photos, I was like, oh, those must be Ruby's journals. Just kept going. Well, then we went back, and I was looking at it with my girlfriend, and she was like, what's that behind it? I was like, what? There's this leather type folder, looks about 3 inches thick to me, underneath these folders that are laid out. Now, I can't see the engraving. Who knows if she had multiple type things like this, but wonder if that's it, and wonder if they really have it. Gives me a little bit of chills to think about, but again, tell me what you think down in the comments. These pen papers, in my opinion, mirror everything that Tom Harrison discloses about himself in the Visions of Glory. It mirrors everything that Chad Daybell seems to talk about in his supposed visions and abilities. Hell, you can go all the way back to the Laffertys in like the 60s and their delusions. All of these people basically have one thing in common, if nothing else. These really extreme, almost rather fundamental beliefs, and this grandiose idea of their role in the second coming of Christ. And what is beginning to emerge, in my opinion, is a pattern, and with these people who have these skewed beliefs, so to speak, if they're left unchecked or maybe underestimated, it always seems to end in some tragedy, right? And though Ruby and Jodi are the people that carried out the crimes, and yes, they should be 1000% held accountable for that, I don't disagree with that whatsoever. To me, they're also just weeds, and the roots remain, and it's festering below the surface only to continue to sprout more weeds. It's like a never-ending cycle unless something changes. And again, this is my opinion, but I believe it starts with the church itself, the religion itself. Anyways, I'm going to end this on a theory of mine and obviously a lot of speculation. My theory is the falling out with the Hannahs was like the brick that caused the castle to crumble, in my opinion, because after that whole fiasco with them, the mental fitness trainers shit seems to just like dissolve almost immediately. There's no more conferences, seminars, retreats, any of that seems to also kind of cease right around this time. And then we see this shift where all of a sudden it's Jodi and Ruby and they're talking about all this parenting stuff. You can even see kind of the shift in Ruby's channel throughout this timeline as well, where it all of a sudden becomes more and more extreme, more intense parenting stuff. So whatever the hell Jodi's visions were during the stay with the Frankes in 2021, I feel like there has to be something in these pen papers that relates to all of this and this shift, and now all of a sudden this idea that they're doing God's work, and the focus seems to zero in on the kids from there. At one point, Jodi even wanted to take over the 8 Passengers brand entirely from the Frankes, and ultimately that doesn't seem to have worked out, and I believe that Jodi was reeling. I think she needed to figure out a way to make money, because I'm sure that everything that followed, all the failures that kind of resulted from the fallout with the Hannahs, was financially difficult. She needed to find a way to make money to support her lifestyle, which was obviously rather luxurious for a therapist. I think that Jodi ultimately realized that adults had more ability to kind of fuck her shit up, so to speak. Adults tend to know their legal rights more. They tend to have a better sense of discernment in situations. Not always, but they tend to. But kids, on the other hand, especially if you label them as troubled kids, they essentially don't have any power without their parents. And who's going to believe a troubled kid over a certified adult in this case, right? It's far easier for a kid to be discredited than it is for an adult a lot of the times. So what if Jodi and Ruby were ultimately planning to do some type of troubled teen or troubled kids program or some shit out there? Hear me out. The troubled teen industry is huge. It is absolutely massive. I have been doing my own research on it ever since the program dropped on Netflix, and I will be doing a whole video on that topic upcoming, but for now I just want to highlight some bullet points, some things that I found interesting and that participated in me drawing some correlation potentially between these facilities and industries and programs and to Jodi and Ruby's kind of plan ultimately. Let me hit a few bullet points of statistics here really quick. Utah is the epicenter of the troubled teen industry, or TTI as I might call it throughout this. Apparently 34% of all teens sent to these programs wind up in Utah. In 2015, I believe it was reported just for that year that TTI brought in $500 million for the state of Utah alone. These programs are wrought with abuse, however. And in some cases, it has been so excessive that it's resulted in loss of life. And yet, they're still, in some cases, getting funding from the states. I know California sends a lot of people to, I think, both Arizona and Utah especially, and their state funding for foster kids and things like that to be sent to these programs that are acting out. And, I mean, parents are still sending their kids to these programs, despite all the information that's out there talking about the abuse that goes on them in these places. Why? One, for the states, a lack of oversight and regulations. It's because of the money. And for two, I think that these particular facilities and programs and organizations really do target the more extreme, high-demand religious people. In this case, I'm going to use Mormonism because that's been primarily the focus, because all the people that we've been talking about are Mormon. Mormons are seemingly immersed into this industry in and of itself. A lot of the facilities are owned and operated by Mormons. Anasazi, he retired, I guess, now from Anasazi, but the main guy for that program actually partnered with a Mormon way back in the day, and I believe that, I can't remember his name, I'll go into it like I said in my upcoming video, but that particular guy that the owner from Anasazi partnered with was one of the guys who kind of sparked the whole behavioral program and Mormons getting involved and realizing how big of a cash crop it was and all this other. There's a whole article out there on it. Anyways, Mormons are immersed into these programs, and you got to think how strict and overbearing they are with their kids and the behaviors of these Mormon kids that most of society would probably just see as normal rebellious behaviors. It's like life or death for Mormon parents. So whether these facilities realize that what they're marketing to, which I think they do, but they market primarily to that demographic, and you'll get other kids from other, beliefs, or maybe parents who don't believe at all ending up there, but those kids seem to be a little bit more extreme, like having real problems with drugs or having real behavioral problems, violent problems, and then you've got them sitting next to a Mormon kid who probably just looked at corn too much, So how does this all relate to Jodi? Well, Jodi's whole career was based off of servicing members of the Mormon community. She's always kind of preyed upon those individuals, and obviously it's her belief structure as well. Arizona has a good population of Mormons, so she's not really straying too far from home. And I haven't seen anything at all come out from the LDS Church or Mormon Church about whether these two being excommunicated at all, which is interesting to me. But I also think that Jodi was someone who chased dollars. I think that she was probably hurting a bit with the collapse of the mental fitness trainers and kind of really the collapse of her whole program surrounding the adults at that time. And so this is a huge cash cow industry. And again, it doesn't have a lot of oversight. There's not any licensing or certification actually really needed for most of these programs. And we never know whether she would have been able to get registered or licensed in Arizona anyways. That's something to consider at least. But lastly, and kind of a big point for me, is why in the hell would you ever need 500 acres? That's a lot of land. 100 acres would have been plenty of land to conceal these kids from the world and not have an issue, especially out in the freaking desert. So why? That's excessive in my mind. So for me, that gives me a reason to believe that they were aiming for something far bigger than just these two children. And so, yeah, we'll never know, and I'm glad for that, but it's just a thought that I had. It's kind of chilling for me personally, but let me know what you think. I'm going to wrap this one up here, though. Keep an eye out for a more in-depth video on this topic for the troubled teen industry. I'm also thinking I might do a little bit of a breakdown for Ruby and Jodi based off of everything that was released as far as their statements and jail calls and such. So yeah, keep an eye out for it. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like what you've seen so far. And until next time, take care and be safe.